On this day where we honor the life and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I thought I would be vulnerable enough to go live. And live means I can't correct anything, I can't fix anything. And yet, uh, I sense your presence out there. I sense the opportunity to be with you and to be connecting with you. This will appear in other places, not live, but at the moment it's coming live, streaming from Zoom onto Facebook, where so many of the people I trust and care about are. Martin Luther King was not and is not a mascot. He's not a symbol. He's not an icon. His name, his legacy, his face has been used for all those things, but that's not primarily how I'm looking at him today. I'm looking at him as a movement leader but particularly today as a public theologian. The term public theologian seems a bit self-aggrandizing if you give that title to yourself. And yet some of us would aspire to be that in some ways. That is, people who speak in the public square and not just inside of churches, and who speak with the Bible in one hand and current events in the other. Martin Luther King was the first, if not the first, one of the first public theologians I became aware of. He was not just a civil rights icon or an historical figure that we revisit once a year. He was a public theologian. He was someone who understood that faith and ethics and political life belong in conversation with one another. He spoke into the moral life of the nation, not from abstraction, but from lived conviction. The crisis of his times, just like the crisis of our times, give rise to those voices that seek to integrate what it means to be a part of God's kingdom and to live theologically in a world that is just sort of jerking. You know, Mama Jode in The Grapes of Wrath, she said, you men live by jerks. You jerk this, jerk that, the time for the. She said, we have more of a rhythm, we women. Well, let me back up and get back to King. King was a Baptist preacher. He was educated in the language and writings of Walter Rauschenbusch. He was influenced deeply by the American transcendentalists, especially Henry David Thoreau, and he drew deeply with others from the well of ethical traditions that they drew from, Gandhi, Thoreau, and others. From those streams, Martin Luther King Jr. embraced nonviolent resistance to evil, not as a tactic of convenience, but as a moral discipline that was aimed at justice and truth and righteousness. Now, here's the tragedy and the mystery. Martin Luther King did all of this in 39 years. He was assassinated at 39, and that still stops me. He was 39 years old when he was assassinated, younger than any of my children are today. When I was 39, I thought I knew a great deal more than I now realize I did at the time. Now, you try to sort that out, but the gist of it is King was already ahead of his time. Not only his times, but his personal time. His formation didn't happen in isolation. If you went to the King family dinner table, it would not be unusual to find the leading white and black pastors, intellectuals, and civic leaders of the day in conversation. MLK. I think in the household they knew them by their first initials, so they called him ML. A lot of his friends called him Mike. A lot of us call him MLK or Dr. King. But MLK's father, Daddy King, was not, and by the way, Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctorate was not honorary. It was a PH ding dang D that he earned. But Dr. King's father, Daddy King, was not merely a prominent pastor. He was one of the great pastors of his generation, especially in the South. He was an intellectual giant in his own right. And Martin grew up steeped in scripture, Baptist theology, wider currents of Christian thought. He was first a thinker and also a pastor. He was a thinker. One can easily imagine him as a lifelong professor, had history unfolded differently. You could see yourself in his class as he broached great ideas. But he was also a good pastor. In that very brief time that he actually was enabled to serve a parish, he practiced ministry rooted in community engagement and public responsibility, but he also visited the sick and he preached the Bible and he administered church business. But he never separated theology from lived reality. Movements often find their leaders is a truism that I have observed and lived. The civil rights movement was already underway. It was searching for leadership capable of articulating its moral vision. Movements also find their leaders. Leaders do not always create movements. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a great organizer, an inspiring voice, and a leader who could translate the pain of the people into disciplined, nonviolent action. For Martin Luther King Jr., leadership was embodied and shared. Look at the pictures of the great marches. Where do you find Martin Luther King Jr.? Not in the middle, not in the back, not out in front by himself walking, but he is at the front, arms often locked with a diverse group of companions. Leadership for Martin Luther King Jr. was never solitary or symbolic. It was embodied, it was shared, and ultimately it was costly. When someone dies at 39, they die unfinished. They're young, their flaws remain, but King had already shed many of the limitations that might otherwise have defined him precisely because of the crisis of the time that demanded growth. He was already and was still, at the time of his death, an evolving person. But his death raises questions. And this is what makes his early death so haunting. What would he have become? What causes would he have championed? What would his moral imagination have unfolded for him, and where would it have taken him next? By the time of his death in Memphis, King had already moved from public opposition to segregation to his opposition to the Vietnam War. And he was grappling seriously with the intersection of civil rights and labor justice. He had championed the poor as a broader cause than just African American diaspora poor. His vision was expanding, not narrowing. And we're remembering Martin Luther King Jr. today for more than his words and his eloquent ways of presenting those words. It is always appropriate to remember Martin Luther King Jr., not merely because of the content of his character, not simply because of his memorable words, and not only because of the affection he still evokes. We remember him because of the movement he helped shape and the moral challenges he pressed upon the nation, challenges that remain unresolved in our own time. Everyone wants to own Dr. King, Too often that desire leads to trimming his legacy down to something quieter, safer, and more convenient. But King welcomed debate. He expected moral struggle, and he embodied a kind of progress we still dream of. The American dream remains unfinished. The American dream King spoke of was not sentimental, it was demanding, and it remains unfinished. That is why King belongs not to a holiday, not to a slogan, but to an ongoing work of moral formation and civic responsibility. That work continues every Wednesday in America.